Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie McClure with the Napa County Office of Education, and I want to welcome everyone joining us in person and virtually. At the Napa County Office of Education, we're committed to creating a collaborative and inclusive learning community. Our goal is to work collectively to ensure equitable and safe environments that celebrate the unique cultures of our children, families, and staff in our programs and throughout the county. In the spirit of this work and in honor of Black History Month, we're pleased to host you today for an educational event featuring author Alex Brown and their book, Hidden History of Napa Valley. Some important thank yous and housekeeping before we get started. I just want to begin by thanking Alex for joining us today and donating their time for this presentation. As a thank you for their generosity, we encourage everyone to consider purchasing Hidden History of Napa Valley online or in-store from Napa Book Mine, and consider leaving a positive review on Amazon to thank them. Also, a big thank you to Napa Book Mine for joining us at the central office today with books available for purchase. We're also pleased to be serving our in-person audience a delicious meal from Buster's Southern Barbecue, a Black-owned business based in Calistoga. And we're sorry, Alex, you can't join us and our online folks can't join us, but next time you're in the area, please stop by Buster's and give them your support. Finally, there'll be an opportunity for our virtual and in-person attendees to ask questions following Alex's presentation. And we'll be raffling off a few copies of the book, both virtually and in person at the end of the event. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's special guest, author Alex Brown. Alex Brown is a queer Black librarian, local historian, writer, and author of 2 books on the history of Napa County, California's marginalized communities. They have a BA with honors in anthropology and sociology, a master's of library and information science, and a master's in US history. They are an Ignite Award-winning and Hugo Award-nominated writer and critic who covers speculative fiction and young adult literature for Tor.com, Locus Magazine, NPR Books, to name a few. So Alex, it's with deep gratitude that I turn the floor over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. 2 things. One, I'm getting aligners and I have new things on my teeth, and so it's a little hard to talk. So if I stumble my words, I apologize. And also, I created a brand new presentation for this event, so I've never test driven it before. So let's get into it and hope it works. If you do have questions as we go along, there's a Q&A box. Please put your question in there. I'm going to try to save the questions until after I'm done with the presentation because it's a little too jarring to jump back and forth. But yeah, please pop them in there and then I will get to the questions. This is an educational opportunity, so if you've got some burning questions and you are not sure how to ask them, you know, I'm coming into this in good faith, so feel free to ask those hard questions. Okay, so let's get into it. Let me share my screen. Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. I need to be able to share my screen, Justin. Anybody on the tech side? Hello. Oh, there it goes. Thank you.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, let me swap over. There we are. And okay. Hopefully everybody can see the screen here. I'm going to get into it. So, exploring Black history in Napa County. I'm going to start off some kind of heavy quotes, sort of back-ending why I did this research and how it kind of came to be. So this is Walter Prescott Webb was one of the preeminent historians of the American West in the mid-20th century. And he defined what part of his definition of what the West was that it lacked water, quote, water, timber, cities, industries, and Negroes. Gunnar Myrdal was a Swedish economist and sociologist, and a lot of his work, he wrote this book called The American Dilemma, and it references the history of the American West. And again, he's claiming Negroes did not participate in the settlement of the West. So again, these are kind of like big framing ideas that there are basically no Black people in the American West. This was actually a very common thing that people have said to me often. There are no Black people in Napa County. This was said to me very commonly, especially when I started working on my US history master's. And I knew pretty much immediately that I wanted to write my thesis on Black history in Napa County. And as soon as I would say, I'm going to write a thesis on Black history in Napa County, the very first thing pretty much every white person in Napa would say to me is, well, there are no Black people. And my answer was, well, there's at least one. There's me. So who am I? So this is me. These are both photos of me growing up in Napa. The one with the ivy is me as a kid. I'm a pet rat person. I've had pet rats most of my life. And I grew up at the Lois D townhomes there, not far from the Queen. The other photo is me when I was very little. This was back in the early 80s when rules about what you could do with your children at work were a little looser. So I don't know if you remember, there's a lab there on Beard Road. It's now owned by the Queen, but at the time it was an independent lab. Dr. Block used to work there. And that is that lab that my mother used to bring me to work with her as a kid. And I would sit in the lab, and yes, those are Petri dishes full of like samples and stuff behind her. So I grew up in Napa. My mother moved to Napa in the 70s, and in the early 70s, I had spent most of my life there. I only moved out last couple of years due to rent prices and all that good stuff. But yeah, I mean, I grew up in Napa. I was almost always one of the only Black kids in my class. It was a kind of a challenging time. But one of the reasons that I wanted to do this research for my thesis was that I wanted to understand why there were so few Black people in Napa, what sort of the historical underpinnings of that was. And I was very pleased to learn that there have been Black people here since pretty much before there were more American people here. So this led to my thesis. I actually used that quote for my title, "There Are No Black People in Napa, History of African Americans in Napa County." And that thesis actually became, I sort of expanded and also shortened it, and it became the Black history chapter that's in the book, Hidden History of Napa Valley. This is the thesis that actually got me that book contract. So one of the first things I started doing was I went through the census records. The 1850 state census does not indicate any African Americans, although I know that there were African Americans here. And I know that there were Afro-Latinx people here, without getting too much into the history of Mexico and New Spain and all that kind of stuff. There was a lot of racial intermixing in the Latinx and Spanish world out here. So there are lots of people with lots of Californios out here with African ancestry. But in terms of African Americans, they first appear in the 1852 census. Because we're a free state, it does not indicate that they were enslaved. But I strongly suspect, like I would be willing to bet my career, that a lot of these people listed as laborers and servants are in fact enslaved people, at least here on a bondage contract. And a bondage contract, because California is a free state, you can be brought in, your slaveholder has you sign a contract that you can't read and you're not literate, so you can't sign it anyways, saying that you'll be brought here, you work as an enslaved person for a set amount of time, and then after that you are set free. That is what's supposed to happen. If you've read the chapter of the book, you will learn that that did not often happen. I talk about how there were many enslaved people who were brought in from like Texas and then taken back out of the state before their bondage contract ended, and then forced to sign another one to come back in. In the case of the Rice family, which is also in the book, some contracts just weren't held up, and there was not much that a person of color could do at the time, a Black person. State law prohibited people of color from testifying in court. So you could bring a case, but then you couldn't like testify about your case, which meant that everything would go to the white person, because the white person's the only one that can make their claim and there's no one there to refute it. And so in the case of Nathaniel Rice in the book, he actually gets held beyond his bondage contract. A couple of prominent African Americans, one Edward Hatton, who we'll talk about in a minute, works off Aaron Rice's charges. He's basically charged with perjury because he can't defend himself in court. And two other prominent African Americans work off his charges on his behalf. And eventually Nathaniel gets free. But that is not an uncommon story. In San Francisco, if you have time to Google the Archie Lee case, That was the big slave case in San Francisco or in California that really tested our laws against slavery out here. So these are the first African Americans that appear in Napa County on an official record. All of these people, we've got some children here. We've got a lot of like 20s and 30-year-olds. If you look at the places of origin, you can immediately tell that they were born into slave states, most likely, which is another indicator that they were probably not brought here free. I was never able to find a formal record of her, just a mention of her in an obituary, but I always like to talk about Lizzie Brooks, and she is mentioned in the book. But she is one of the earliest African Americans that I could find. She died at like 106 or something, and she claimed to have been here in about 1848, 1849. And she doesn't appear on any of these old records, but I take her word for it. So Edward Hatton, as I mentioned, a very prominent African American in Napa County. He was born free. He's mentioned quite regularly in the book. He's also mentioned in my second book, The Lost Restaurants of Napa County. I'll talk about why in just a sec. But one of the important things I think about local history, especially with marginalized history, is that it's important to let people talk for themselves. It's really tempting as historians to want to summarize people's words and explain what you think they're saying, but I think it's really important that if they've said something, to let them speak for themselves. So this is Edward Hatton talking about basically trying to get the same rights as everybody else. This is on the heels of the Reconstruction Amendments, which allow for suffrage for Black men, which allow for citizenship in the 14th Amendment, those kind of things. So why should we of the state be treated with so much injustice? Are we not as intelligent as any class of the community? And are we not taxed as well as others? Why this distinction? I think it is time we should be doing something for ourselves. It's really tempting, or excuse me, when we're taught US history in high school, we're often taught Black history as slavery and civil rights. And we don't talk about really anything that happens around that or within those two time periods. And that within that time period, that's kind of where Edward Hatton is writing. And there's a lot of sort of like rising ourselves up, not bootstrapping, but like, if we're not going to get it from the federal government, we're going to do it ourselves. So that's when you start to see what were called colored schools. So the schools created by and for Black people. It's the rise of the AME Church, the African American Methodist Episcopal Church. We get one of those here in Napa in this time period. We do have a colored school that operates out of that church. And you can actually see here, if you look, it's a little hard to read, but if you look at this, at the number of Black children attending the colored school in Napa, there's one colored school and there are a number of colored children. We have 28, and oh, I forgot to write down the date for this one. It's the 1870s, I believe, or the 1870s, which is a good fair amount. I mean, we're not that far behind. You know, the mining counties, of course, have a lot. Los Angeles, and we're not that far behind it. So we had a fair number of African Americans living here now. At this time, too, there's an intentional push to try to bring African Americans into Napa County and really settle it. We have 10 farmers with huge acreage just around Napa City alone. We've got people up in, we've got a Black family up in St. Helena, the Vessies, which I'll talk about in a second. We've got Sparrow here, who was one of the first, the first African American to register to vote in the Napa County when voting became legal. We're running businesses. We're doing all kinds of really interesting, exciting things. Edward Hatton and his wife opened the arcade, or bought the Arcade restaurant. And then Margaret Miller, who was, I believe, a daughter-in-law, I'm still a little hazy on the connection, but she eventually takes over the Arcade restaurant. It operates in the 1870s. It is, as far as I can tell, the first Black-owned restaurant in Napa County, and other than Buster's, may have actually been the only other Black-owned restaurant in Napa County. I'm not entirely sure, but it's definitely those two, Arcade and Buster's, are, if there are more than that, I would be very surprised. So we're doing all these kind of really exciting, interesting things. In Napa, we did not have a Black population large enough to just have like a Black neighborhood or businesses that catered just to Black residents, which eventually in part becomes part of the downfall of the Black community in Napa, which I'll get to in a second. So I mentioned the Veseys, William Vesey up in St. Helena. This is a St. Helena school. We're not sure which one, but you can see in the second row there, for me, if I'm facing it, it's the far left, but Irene Vesey is one of the daughters, one of the Vesey daughters, and William Vesey, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but she's right here. William Vesey is the first Black man in Napa County to run for political office. He runs for Board of Trustees up in St. Helena. And as far as I can tell, he's the only person who votes for himself, which I find rather disappointing. But yeah, he doesn't win. And they only lived up there for a little bit longer. And tragically, every child in that family died. It was really, really sad. Moving along, we've got the Canner family. The Canners are the longest, I should say, the longest occupying Black family in Napa County. The first Canner showed up in 1852, formerly enslaved person who was freed, came over on an ox cart, came all the way out from the Midwest, out here to California, settled out there in the Dry Creek Road area initially. And then from 1852, basically until William Jennings here, he passed away, I believe in like I should have Googled this earlier, I can't remember. It's in the book when he passed away. I believe it was like 2005 or 2010 or something, but fairly recently. And they do have other descendants, they just don't live in Napa County, but they had a run, from mid 1800s all the way to the early 2000s living here in Napa County. And then these are some of their descendants, William Jennings, of course, here. And then Julia Canner and Maisie Barfield were some earlier descendants as well. So I've mentioned slavery. These kind of enslaved ads, these wanted ads popped up all over the place after the Civil War. It says Hiram Bigsby, but it's actually Hiram Grigsby. It came from the same area as the other Grigsby families. I know he was enslaved at some point. I haven't been able to confirm if he came over with the Bigsbys, or with the Grigsbys as an enslaved person, or if it's just coincidental, I don't know. But I do know that he was separated from his family at some point as an enslaved person. And so he put out this advertisement while he was living in Napa. He owned property right near the Veterans Home. It's part of the Hopper Creek Vineyard, the Hopper Vineyard area right now. He owned a lot of that land. Or worked a lot of that land, excuse me. And so he put an ad out looking for to be reunited with his family. And unfortunately, as far as I can tell, he never reconnected with his family. I spent a lot of time researching his wife and children, could not find any record of them. But again, if you read the ad, he's connected up with William Vesey. So there's this great like intra-community connection. Like nobody was out there alone. Everybody was tied into each other. Everybody went to the AME churches or the schools. Everybody like frequented everybody's homes. There were constantly picnics and celebrations. Like nobody was an island if you were a Black person in Napa County. So moving a little bit further in here, one of the interesting things I did with the census records is I dug really into the demographics, with a caveat that census records are woefully incomplete. A lot of people of color do not appear on census records, and they can be very misleading. So you have to look at it broadly. You can't look at it individually. But this will kind of give you a spoiler as to what's coming. So you can see in the 1870s, we've got lots of skilled trades. We've got lots of agriculture. The housewife is an interesting indicator because it indicates that there was some flexibility, that women didn't need to seek out another job, but a lot of housewives were also midwives and doing other work as well. But you start to see a big shift where this kind of skilled trades and like agriculture kind of jobs start to drop off. And by the 1900s, there's a massive increase in unemployment, and also a big increase, particularly starting in the 30s, with domestic service. And there's sort of two main reasons for it. One, we just never had a Black community large enough or concentrated enough to draw in enough new people, or to keep the kids that were born here to stay here. There were there were a lot of businesses we couldn't enter. There were a lot of things that we couldn't do. It's harder to buy a home. It's harder to live if you're, just the one Black family in an entire neighborhood. We didn't have as many amenities as like San Francisco or Sacramento, so it was harder to keep people here and it was harder to get people here. But also, turn of the century is where we start seeing a big increase in reduction of rights, so that the glass ceiling gets lower and lower and lower. If you know anything about labor history in terms of like unions and things in San Francisco, they basically barred all Black people from like anything other than janitorial. You couldn't join the unions, you couldn't do anything. And it's the same in Napa County. You start to see the jobs shift from, you know, blacksmith and horse racer, and all of a sudden it's janitorial, custodial, domestic. Like those are the only jobs that you can get. So if you're living in an area where there aren't a lot of Black people and the economic ceiling is so low that you can no longer buy a house, you can only rent. You can't get a job other than servicing, doing service work for white people. Like, what's the impulse to stay? Well, there isn't one. So we start to see a big drop, and the increase that you start to see in population rates in the early 20th century has a lot to do with the type of labor that we're doing. So you can see here, owners and renters start to drop off, and lodgers and employees start to increase, and that is directly tied to domestic service. So again, and same with the age range, as you can see here too, the drop in young people, like children, the drop in elderly, and the increase in sort of the age, like the 18 to 64 has a dramatic increase. That's all domestic service. So speaking of the sort of the turn of the century, we start to see an increase in racial tensions. So I know a lot of people, when we started the 2020s before the pandemic, were like, oh, it's going to be the new jazz age and all this stuff. I was like, for African Americans, the 1920s was not this exciting time period with, lots of fun. I mean, there was lots of fun music, but it was a very challenging time for Black people. And this is a photo. You can see Lovejoy's Drugs here. That was a parade here in Napa. And I found this photo in the Napa County Historical Society, and you can kind of see the caption of this photo that came in the photo album was, quote, "Darkies in the Dark." So it's a parade, blackface. I don't know who the people are, but it's kind of that attitude. And when you have so few Black people in Napa County by this point, you're just kind of stuck dealing with it. There's a story in there where I talk about the KKK in Napa. And I mentioned in the book that, the KKK at one point even hired a Black person to do their barbecue for them. So it's a really weird time in Napa. So tied with all these racial tensions, of course, we've got the Klan, who's very active in Napa County. They have several large parades. Again, those are described in the book, but we've got the one in St. Helena, which was their second one, which had, I think, 10,000 spectators or something like that. We've got, people in full regalia. We have regular meetings. There's a Klan speaker who comes to Napa almost every week or every other week to give speeches at Napa High about how great the Klan is. And this was not, sort of a hidden thing. It was out there that, that we had political candidates. We had city council people who were openly members of the Klan and were proud of it and had no issues about it. So this is, a lot of people often ask me about that mural on the fountain that I hear has now been covered up. And I do like to touch on the Klan because it does impact African Americans in Napa County, but I also want to remind particularly my white audience that the way I look at it, the Klan isn't really Black history. It's white people history. It's something that y'all need to grapple with and figure out how to work through. It definitely impacted me and my ancestors. And continues to impact me and my people today. But it's not just Black history. And I think it's a detriment to understanding how the world works to just lump it into when we talk about slavery or we talk about civil rights. Because the Klan existed outside of just hating Black people. Like, they went after Catholics, they went after Jews, they went after anybody who wasn't Protestant, they went after Italians, they went after immigrants. There's a lot of people that came under the ire of the Klan. And it was not always what we hear of in the South with the sheets and the hoods and the fires and the big parades. Like, it was day-to-day life. The Klan often had picnics at the park, so that's something to reckon with. Tied in with that too, about the same time period, you start to get redlining. And redlining is a formal thing you can see on this map. It's actually like a formal designation. It means you don't get loans from the banks. It's harder to move in and out. If your neighborhood gets turned red, then that depreciates the value of your home. You can see, if you look at population maps and poverty maps of big cities today, you can line them up almost exactly with these old redlining maps. Like, Black people were not allowed to purchase home. All of these brand new developed homes in the Western edition of San Francisco, Black people weren't allowed to buy those homes. So they're all white neighborhoods. And you think about, where everybody is today. Napa did not have a formal redlining map, but it had redlining in spirit. And it was also, as far as I can tell, not officially a sundown town. We did not have signs up that said no Black folk allowed, but it was unofficial. When I was doing my thesis, I interviewed quite a few African Americans who were here in the 60s and 70s attempting to come in. And every single one of them had stories. One person, like the highway patrol, would sit on the road and pull every Black person over and remind them to leave by nighttime if they were coming in from Vallejo. Even my own mother has a story about trying to buy a home in Napa in the 80s. And she'd see a home, it would be available, she'd make an appointment with a real estate agent. As soon as she walked into the door of the home, all of a sudden the house wasn't available. And the only reason we ended up getting the condo that we have is because the white homeowner lived out of town, just wanted to get rid of the property. The real estate agent tried to talk him out of the sale to my mother, and he just overrode her and went on with the sale anyways. So it's a constant issue. I know people in the last couple of years who've struggled to get property in Napa. So it's an ongoing problem. But it really starts in the 30s with the homeowners loan corporation maps and the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Administration. It leads to a lot of these racial covenants that we have. This is straight out of a deed from South Gordon Terrace. It was built 2 years after these kind of restrictive covenants were declared illegal, basically, but we kept doing it in Napa. And it basically bans any person of color from owning property. The only way you can live on these properties is if you are a domestic servant. That's pretty much it. And these racial covenants are not uncommon. If you've got an older home and it hasn't gone through a lot of sales, you might want to check your deed. Obviously, it's not legally binding anymore, but and you can have it removed if you want to. But if you do have an older home, I would encourage you to check out your deed. Sort of the consequences of all this. This is a really intense quote, but I am going to read it because I think it's important. The Sentinel was a Black newspaper that operated, I believe, out of Los Angeles, and one of their editors sort of saw this coming very early on with the introduction of the redlining maps, and this is what he said in 1938. And you can imagine, even still in 1950, that this was happening, 1960, 1970s, in Napa County. It took some of the Jewish real estate agents who were willing to break these rules, sort of the informal redlining that we had, and rent or sell to African Americans to finally break the redlining that we had here in Napa. But this quote, like I said, intense, but I think it's revealing. Hitler's despicable plan to herd German Jews into ghettos will be people who are hearing about Hitler's despicable plan, to herd German Jews into ghettos will be surprised to learn that their own government has been busily planning ghettos for American Negroes through the Federal Housing Agency. He added that while American plans lack the forthright and brutal frankness of Hitler's plans, but in the long run, it is calculated to be just as effective. And in a lot of ways, it was. Again, when you hear the comment, there are no Black people in Napa, my next thought is two things. One, there are, you're just not paying attention. And two, why are there so few African Americans? And it's not by chance. Like I said, in the 1860s, there was an intentional push by African Americans to try to settle and build a community in Napa. And Napa said no. Napa, California, everybody said no. And that is why we're still struggling today. So moving forward, again, I want to kind of bring this back to the personal. My mother moved in, like I said, in the 70s. She was represented in the local newspaper in the Napa Register back then, which I love. That was her in the lab. There's another photo down below with her and her Cessna. She had a plane, and she was, as far as I can tell, the first Black person, first Black pilot at Napa County Airport. So I always think that's very cool. She struggled to be here as well. Like I said, she's struggling to buy a home, struggling to get settled in. It was, she didn't have a lot of Black friends in Napa because there were not a lot of Black people in Napa. But we all kind of knew each other. We'd all heard of each other. There's stories and stories and stories, lots of stuff that I wrote about in my thesis that I didn't put in the book because I only had so many words to use, and I had to kind of cut a time period off. But one of the things I am excited about moving forward, the 1950 census was released last year. And I've already started kind of going through that census data and trying to record the new African Americans and the new Black people that have moved into Napa. And I really want to see, I'm excited to see how the population shifts between 1940 and 1950. To see who kind of came in during World War II, may have worked in the shipyards, renting property, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that is my 30 minutes. I know that's a lot, and I kind of really breezed through stuff. I tried not to touch on too much that was already in the book, but kind of give you an overview. So I'm going to end it there in terms of the presentation. Actually, last slide, find my books, Lost Residents of Napa Valley and Hidden Histories of Napa Valley. And yeah, I will pause there. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. Okay, here we go. My thesis, I believe, is available at Napa County Historical Society. I think they have a copy of it there. And if not, you can find me on my blog. I have a contact form. And we can go from there. The PowerPoint, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint with. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint. I will do that after this. And yeah, happy to do that. Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm happy to be here. It was just a thank you for being here. Okay, we've got 2 questions from in person that we're collecting. If you've got any other questions, you're welcome to drop them in too. Again, if you've got that burning question that you weren't sure who to ask, you didn't want to ambush a random Black person around town, but you really want to know and you want to ask it respectfully, this is the opportunity to do it. You might not get another one. Here we go. Have you explored the histories of other places in the Bay Area? Yes, but only sort of partially. So I have touched on in my own research, San Francisco. I kind of needed to because San Francisco and Sacramento and Marysville a little bit, because a lot of African Americans from Napa moved to San Francisco, Marysville, or Sacramento. They had pretty high Black populations. So I've done some tangential research on there in those areas. Not a lot of in-depth stuff, but enough to kind of have a sense of their Black populations. And then also Marin. So after Napa, I lived in Marin on and off for about 10 years. And for the Mill Valley Historical Society, I wrote a piece on Black history in Mill Valley. So I do know quite a bit about Marin's Black history, and there's also some crossover between those as well. Let's see here. Can you expand on your approach to researching the book? I'm curious if storytelling played a significant role. I'm not sure what you mean by storytelling. I tried not to do, I try not to do too much like informal storytelling. I wanted to just kind of tell the people's stories as they were, but I did try to write it sort of colloquially. I couldn't find a lot, well, let me rephrase that. Historic stories about life in Napa, other than what was in the newspapers, no. But everything sort of past 1950 and beyond, almost all of that came from like interviews and stories that people had told me about what life was like. And then my research process for my thesis and my book was a lot of staring at my computer, finding sources at various historical societies and genealogies. There are digitized newspaper collections, the California Digital Newspaper Collection, and then also Napa County's digital archives. the Napa County Library Digital Archives, it has possibly the worst search mechanism I've ever used in my life. But yeah, I spend a lot of time going through newspapers, going through local historical society stuff, going through, there was not a lot in books, so it was a lot of finding sort of additional information, finding names and things in census records, and then like deep dive into ancestry, trying to track them down, a lot of that kind of stuff. From your perspective, how can Napa use this knowledge of history to be more inclusive and build a more diverse community? Oh, that is a big question. And the answer really is affordable housing, which I know we don't like here in Napa. And we have a lot of issues with it, but yeah, affordable housing, you know, we've got to break the zoning rules that we've got to build more affordable housing. We have got to really keep track of the informal redlining that we still do to this day. And just kind of be more aware of each other and our neighbors, making sure that people feel welcome at all times. I mean, yeah, I did a Black History presentation at the Napa County Library many years ago. It's probably 8 years ago at this point. And I had like several Black people came up to talk to me after the presentation, and all of them were not from Napa. They all moved into Napa in the last 5 years. And I remember very clearly one of them saying, I moved from rural Georgia to Napa, and that person experienced more racism in Napa in the last few months than they had their whole life in Georgia. So we got a lot of things we need to grapple with. I'm going to jump back here to the Q&A piece. Oh, I answered that one. Students want to know if this type of segregation is still happening in Napa. Informally, yes. So, I mean, again, we don't have formal redlining maps. And it's certainly not as explicit as it used to be. You know, it used to be that the white realtors, the white non-Jewish realtors and real estate agents had a sort of agreement, basically, that they weren't going to sell or rent to Black people, at least in certain areas. I would say it's probably not that explicit anymore. I would count on it not being that explicit, but those internal biases still hold. So if you think about where people of color are, where low-income people of color are congregated, what neighborhoods they're congregated into, what type of housing they're congregated into, and you think about who owns the other properties, you could pretty much do a redlining map in Napa County today. Certainly in Napa City, it gets worse when you go up Valley and you start looking at where migrant workers and low-income, you know, retail and service workers are living. Like, start, you know, yeah, start looking at your neighborhoods. And again, the question isn't, you know, well, there are not any people here. It's why aren't there any people here? And the answer is usually not a good one. Have you also calculated the financial impact of redlining for? I have not. I am not a math person. I do not like math at all. That's why I became a librarian, so I wouldn't have to do math. But I mean, it's obvious. I mean, I have a lot of white friends who, and so I'm in my late 30s. I'm a millennial, older millennial. All of my white friends own a home. All of them do. And they all own a home because they all inherited wealth from their family. I mean, not, you know, millions of dollars, but they all were able to inherit money that had been passed down from an elder. I do not have that option. My grandmother left nothing to, you know, my grandparents left nothing to their children. They didn't have any generational wealth. They were only, my grandmother was the granddaughter, oh, excuse me, my grandmother was born to somebody who had been born in slavery. So there's no generational wealth. I have nothing to inherit. So I will not be buying a home. And I know many Black people in that situation. Okay, let's see here. What can Napa Valley schools do to make Black students and families feel welcome and included? That's a question I don't know that I'm comfortable answering. I mean, I went to school and I graduated in 2001. I attended that Black History, you know, the Black History event. I can't remember what church it's held at, but it was just held fairly recently. And a couple of years ago, I moderated a panel with some young Black Napans. And unfortunately, their stories were very similar to mine. So my suggestion would be to talk to Black teens, like talk to them. I mean, I can tell you what I liked and didn't like. that information is 20 years old at this point, although it's a lot of the same problems cycling again and again. But I guarantee you, young Black Napans, they know what they want from Napa schools. And it's probably a lot more radical than anything I would have thought of when I was 14 or 15 back then, when we weren't even thinking about this kind of stuff. So ask them, set up forums, do surveys, ask them, get them involved. They will tell you what they need. And they've probably been telling you what they need this whole time and haven't been felt like they've been listened to. Okay, I'm going to jump back to the in-person questions here. Let's go back up. What gave your mom strength to stay in Napa? So again, we're not that far from slavery. There's a lot of just kind of suck it up and deal with it kind of attitude. My mother taught me a lot about how to pick your battles and how to figure out what you can fight and what you can't fight. And with the what you can't fight, figure out where your line is of whether you can live with it or not. And then she was also a single mother, and she had a well-paying job at the Queen, and she had me. And if she left, she might not have been able to get another well-paying job. And at the time, it was fairly affordable to live in Napa. So a lot of those factors just kind of lined up. But I will also say that she no longer lives in Napa. So if that tells you anything. What are some of the ways that you've taken care of yourself emotionally through writing your thesis? Writing the thesis was actually fine. It was writing the hidden history book, particularly the chapter about Chinese people, because I had to basically like make a list of racist terminology that white people used for Chinese people and read like newspaper story after newspaper story after newspaper story, just the vilest things you can imagine. And all of it just printed gleefully in the local newspapers. So that was really rough. I spent almost 4 or 5 weeks reading those newspaper articles to collect data on what was happening with Chinese people in Napa, at least filtered through the white lens. And after that, I took 2 weeks off. Like I didn't touch the book at all because I could not. I just took 2 weeks off. I went to the beach. I relaxed. I read some books. I watched some TV, and I just didn't think about it because it was very draining. And unfortunately, that's sort of the nature of it. A lot of compartmentalizing and just trying to listen to the people listen to the people of color as much as I could to make sure that their stories were witnessed. I'm curious if Californians of color were required to pay taxes, and then how did the state justify no funding for integrated public schools? Yes, they did, and it's called racism. That's how they justified it. They justified it through separate but equal. And because basically that said, if you are, as long as you're paying taxes, we're giving you a school. It doesn't matter that your school is in the basement and it's full of mold and you don't have resources or textbooks. It's still a school. Doesn't matter that there was one Black school in like all of San Francisco that all Black children had to go to, and it didn't matter how far away it was or how many closer white schools there were. So that's how they justified it, separate but equal. Mary Frances Ward, I believe, is mentioned in the book, her story about desegregating or attempting to desegregate San Francisco schools. And in Napa County, it came down to money. So eventually it got to a point where it was just too expensive for the county school system to operate white schools and one Black school. So that was what eventually collapsed the quote unquote colored school that we had in Napa. And the students were integrated into the white school. And then as you saw with that photo of Irene Vesey, in St. Helena, they didn't have a colored school, and they certainly were not, the Veseys were certainly not going to, you're talking like the 1870s, 1880s. You're not driving down from St. Helena every day to Napa for school. So she was integrated right in. But yeah, they did it legally. It was legally allowed. Do you know the histories of Buster's Barbecue being located in Napa? I do not know the history of Buster's Barbecue, except that on the grounds of Buster's Barbecue is the old mausoleum for some of the Brannan family members, for Sam Brannan. The bodies are not there, but the mausoleum is there. So go check that out next time. Okay, 2 more questions or 2 more comments from in person, and then I'll jump to Q&A again. I've personally seen the deed on a house in the Westwood area with the text, "No Africans allowed." Oh yeah, there are many houses in Napa County. Look, like I said, anything built from about the 1940s and beyond, there's a good chance, unless they've been removed, there's a good chance that a restrictive covenant will be on those deeds. One more comment. I love that your mom is the pilot featured in your book. Yes, that is my mother. Of course, I had to close that chapter in the book. It's my mother. Okay, back to the Q&A. Were there any examples of lynching in Napa? No. Well, lynching as in like the Klan and a hanging? No, that did not happen. Our Klan was not the hoods and torches, other than their big like initiation events. Our Klan was much more and this is common in a lot of places outside the South, where they're politicians and they're church members and they're all kinds of things. And actually it's a really good parallel to today, where even our most extremist political leaning people go about day-to-day life, and they join book banning groups and try to get teachers fired from their jobs, but in their day-to-day life they're receptionists and doctors and lawyers and regular people. So we didn't have that kind of lynching. Now if you want to talk about police brutality, that's a different subject. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Let's see here. How has the enforcement of low-level work impacted our current economic standing? Well, in terms of African Americans living in Napa, it's a little different. So almost all of the African Americans that came in the 19th century their families are no longer here. The Jennings family, the Jennings and the Canners, that was the only 19th century family that lasted into the 20th century, or long into the 20th century. Every other Black family that came into Napa in the 19th century left or died off pretty early on into the 20th century. So that kind of generation, it's just not the same. The African Americans that are here today, some came in the 30s and 40s as part of those domestics. In fact, William Jennings' wife came in from Texas I believe in the 30s as a nurse to work in, I believe actually in the Schramsberg house, or for the Schramsberg family as an in-home nurse. So she was a domestic. So some of those people, but again, a lot of their children left. A lot of their children didn't stay in Napa. And that generation has all died off for the most part. So most African Americans that are living in Napa today, I would say the overwhelming majority came in the 60s and beyond. So they came as part of what's known as the Second Great Migration. The First Great Migration was during the war and a little bit earlier, and this is the Second Great Migration. So a lot of them are more on the affluent side, or at least educated, in the sense that they have secondary degrees, they're teachers, they're medical professionals, librarians, at least with a college degree or higher. So it's a different kind of structural set. We can't really compare the African Americans from the 19th century to the group that are currently living in Napa today. Let's see here. Do you have any information on African Americans who were treated in Napa in the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights period? A little bit. That's what I'm hoping the census data will give me, at least for the 1950s. But there were also so few African Americans that were here. There weren't every African American getting into town and doing a big protest. That wasn't happening. I expect that if there were protests, they were probably doing them in Solano County or elsewhere. There were a lot of protests, there were protests from Vallejo High School students who didn't want to play in Napa, or Black people who would come to Napa and be harassed. It's sort of that low-level ongoing microaggression combined with redlining and that kind of thing. So that's often what's happening. But Black people were not doing huge protests in Napa County at the time, because there just weren't enough of them to do. Yeah, it's kind of, when I was researching the civil rights period in the local newspapers, I was very disappointed at the lack of coverage, and I think a lot of that was tied to just a lack of activity and a lack of white people white people were doing things, like there was a pastor, I believe, at a Methodist church who was like part of the Selma protests. So there were a lot of white people who were doing things in the civil rights movement, but driven by African Americans, no, not really. Certainly involved, but like I said, there was no like, Selma bus riots or anything happening in Napa. Do you have any teachers of color growing up, and did you have teachers who helped you navigate learning about Black history, being an only? No, no, and no. I didn't have any teacher of color until I went to college. I went to Mills College in Oakland. That was also where I had my first and my only, to this point, Black teacher that I've ever had in my life. None of them cared that I was only. They just made sure that I knew that I was Black, and they made that very clear that that was not a good thing. And we did not learn about Black history. I went to a church school in Napa, and we did not learn about Black history. We learned about slavery, and that was it. But my mother is of that generation. There's a lot of us Black millennials that grew up there. Blanking on the name. There's a comic book. It was called like Gold Comics or something. It was all Black history people. My mother taught me everything I needed to know about Black. Like I went into my history classes knowing way more than even many of my teachers. In fact, I remember to this day, I had a white teacher, AP US History, junior year at Vintage, who got in an argument with me that he insisted that the Civil War was fought over taxes. And I disagreed. And he got so mad at me that I was not allowed to speak in class again. So that was, or I did not feel comfortable speaking in classes again. So it was not a pleasant experience for me. Okay, MCAN High School has a Black Student Club. Oh, that's great because there's so many Black students, but Napa High, New Tech, Vintage, to my knowledge, don't. That doesn't surprise me. Should these clubs be mandatory? No, I don't think they should be mandatory, but I do think that, because I think the worst thing you can do is like, if you make them mandatory, then it's tokenizing. Then you're forcing a Black student to join a group specifically tied to their race that they may not want to or feel comfortable with for whatever reason want to participate in that. That said, it should be mandatory that it's an option and that the students feel empowered. And by mandatory, I mean that there should be policies in place that if Black students get together, or Latinx students, or Asian American students, or queer students get together and say, we want an affinity group and we want school support on it, that the school should have a system set in place where they can say yes, and here's your funding, and here's your time period, here's your teacher, whatever you need to do. So it shouldn't be mandatory that they exist, but there should be, every school should have policies and processes set in place to make the students feel empowered to ask for that if that's something that they want. And yeah, it does not surprise me given the history. If you know about Napa, if you were here in Napa before MCAN was a place, other than like a way stop before the Walmart and all that, yeah, it does not surprise me, the demographics of those school clubs. Okay, last two comments in the Q&A. Thank you, shedding light on redlighting Napa. Even though I've been here since I was 6, I still do not feel welcome in American Canyon. That also does not surprise me. Again, given the weird history of American Canyon, where depending on who you talk to, it was either too white to be Vallejo or too Black to be Napa. That was always sort of the jokey comment that was made to me when I was growing up. So yeah, it does not surprise me. Last question in the Q&A, and then I'll jump back to the chat. Were African Americans not protesting Napa because of the Klan in the 1980s and 90s? They supposedly had headquarters in Napa. I mean, the Klan had headquarters in Napa going back to the 20s. I mean, we had chapters in Calistoga and Napa, and I believe in St. Helena too. I'm not 100% certain on that, but yeah, I mean, the Klan has been active. I know a Black person in Napa who encountered a Klan member in the last 10 years, had some, I don't want to give too many details because it's not my story to tell, but yes, has had some encounters with some Napa Klan people in the last 10 years. I don't know that they have a chapter. I have not, some people have mentioned to me that there was a chapter. There's not, as far as I can tell, a current official, formally recognized chapter in Napa County. But I mean, I would bet millions of dollars that I don't have that there are, actively engaged Klan members in Napa County at this time. Like that would not surprise me at all. So yeah, so I don't know about the 80s or 90s. I don't have any way to research that on my end. So I don't know what was going on in the 80s and 90s, but again, wouldn't surprise me. No, it wasn't that they were not protesting because of the Klan. By the civil rights era, the Klan in Napa is not really a thing. Like I said, there are Klan members, but there's no chapter. There's nobody's marching. I mean, in fact, you can look at the Aryan festival protest that happened. I believe it was in the not clear on my date read, in the 80s. That was going to be out in Jameson Canyon. And the sheer amount of like pushback to that in Napa. So it wasn't the Klan that was stopping African Americans from protesting. We just didn't have enough African Americans to do a big protest, and they're scattered all over the county. So like in the 1980 census, there's something like 300 Black people in like Napa. I can't even remember if it was Napa City or Napa County. Might have been the county. I'll have to look at I think it was the county. I think there's 300 Black people in the county in the 1980 census. So, it's getting all 300 of those people. Some of those are children, some of those are elderly people. Not all of us knew each other, scattered around like that. How do you get any kind of momentum going for that? Okay, so dismiss that. I'm going to jump back to the in-person stuff. Let's see, what did I answer? The Westwood area, Miles Pilot. When you finish with Q&A, you can toss back. Okay, sorry, that's from somebody else. Is there a DEI educational company that you would recommend for teaching school teachers about how to include Black students and how to stand up for student parents who still use the N-word on campuses and in class? I don't have a list of companies. DEI is something that I am struggling with at the moment. And I say this as somebody, I've been doing DEI work since before DEI was like a phrase. Like the idea of, one of the first things I did when I got hired at Napa County Historical Society, because I used to run the archives and the research library there. One of the first things my executive director at the time did was we basically were like, we are no longer going to be actively trying to hunt down material on like George Yount or Sam Brannon or these rich old white dudes who own lots of stuff. If people wanted to donate that stuff to us, that was fine, but we weren't actively looking for it, because we were going to be actively instead looking for everybody else, looking for people of color, looking for queer people, looking for the poor, looking for immigrants, looking for all of these other people who never get represented in local history. That is DEI work. We changed policies. We created a collection development plan. We created a strategic plan. We made institutional choices. We reframed the institution's goals and its interests to make sure that we were not excluding all of these other voices. And that is DEI. That is what I believe that DEI should be. It should be institutional change. It should be policy change. It has to be intentional, and it has to be hard. If you're walking out of DEI meetings feeling comfortable and safe, and you are not a person of color, you're not a marginalized person, then it's not DEI, as far as I'm concerned. DEI today has become very sort of corporatized and commercialized. When I think about DEI work, I think about, I would want to put myself out of a job, basically, if I was a DEI professional. I would want to be able to go to a place, help them reframe their policies, make institutional structural change so that I did not need to be there in 5 years. Like the school would be set up, or the institution would be set up to do that work on their own. And a lot of DEI professionals today are not in that mindset. Like they can, it's a mindset of kind of keeping their job to some extent. So it's focused on programming. It's focused on shallow changes. It's focused on reform, but it doesn't deal with the institutional power. And it makes sense. If Xerox is hiring a DEI professional to come in, that they don't want a DEI professional who's going to tell them, well, everybody at the top basically needs to quit and you need to redo your entire structural model because it's exploitative all the way through. Like they don't want to hear that. So I think it's really important that whatever DEI organization that you go through it making sure that the group that you're bringing in, or even before that, you need to figure out what it is, what your end goal is. Is your end goal programming? Is your end goal affinity groups? Or is your end goal real institutional structural change? whatever you decide your goal is going to be, that's going to determine or influence who you pick as your DEI as your DEI organization. So if you want to break the system, if you want to dismantle your power structures, then go look for a DEI group that's going to help you do that policy work. If that's not something that you want to do, or not something you want to do right now, and you want to focus on student experiences and sort of the other surface level stuff, that's fine too. You find a DEI professional that can help you do that work. It's all work, it's all valid. But if you're going with the latter, then you're always going to have ongoing challenges when it comes to inclusivity and racism and queerphobia, because you're not addressing the root structural issues. And that's also my opinion. I have very strong opinions about it. And I'm also changing my opinions. I'm learning, I'm listening to other people who are experts in this field. And so my opinion on DEI is ever shifting. So let's see, I've got one more question that I want to in here in the Q&A, and then I will pass it back. Do you support reparations for Black people in Napa? Yes and no. So I support reparations for African Americans. Remember that Black people is a diasporic term, so it includes people from mainland Africa, it includes people from the Caribbean, it includes Afro-Latinx, Afro-Indigenous, everything. African Americans are the ones descended from, well, not even all, but actually, yes, I guess really all. I support reparations for African Americans descended from enslaved people. It gets a little murky from there, how you determine what reparations are, and how you determine who qualifies for it. And those I'm still a little bit up in the air, like I don't know, and maybe I don't think there's going to be one flat answer for it. I also don't think necessarily that handing me a lot of cash is going to do me any good, although I do like money. But maybe in some circumstances, reparations look like what happened down in is it Bryan's Beach here in Southern California? It was known as Manhattan Beach, part of it, and they gave the land back to the family, Bryce's Beach, that it was taken from them in the 20th century. So maybe reparations looks like that. Maybe reparations looks like housing stipends. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily have to be 40 acres and a mule anymore. I think there are bigger ways that we can look at reparations for people descended from enslaved people. But we have to be really careful about how we do that, because not a lot of us can trace our ancestries back very far. I can only go back to that first generation that was freed from slavery. And I don't have a lot of records on that. Like I have not been able to find records. But I also don't want to get into blood quantum either. So I don't know. Yes, I do support it. How that's actually implemented, I don't know. Okay, so it looks like that is it for my in-person and my Q&A questions. So I am going to toss it back to my lovely hosts here. Thank you so much. Hopefully toss it back. Is somebody jumping on? There we are.
Thank you so much, Alex. This is very thought-provoking. Really appreciate the time you put into the book and into sharing with us. I think I'm leaving with lots of ideas percolating in my mind about how we can listen to our Black students and make some structural changes that are really important. So I hope everybody is leaving with that inspiration as well. So thank you very much. We do have we raffled off a couple of books to our online participants. So before we let them go, I wanted to let Christine Mesner and Kian Lauser know you are the winners of the book. Yay. So we will make sure that we get that to you, our online guests. And for our in-person, stick around. We're going to raffle off once we say goodbye to our online folks, which I think we are ready to do, right? Okay. Again, thank you, Alex. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here, and I hope you all learned a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.